Good evening. Good evening, everyone. That was nice. Thank you. Simon Jacobson here. I welcome you all. Every morning we say, traditionally there's a prayer we say, Emoda ani lifanecha, I acknowledge to you. Lifanecha also means not just to you, but before you, or within you. Shechzata binishmasi, that you've returned my soul to me. So that happened this morning, or the moment you woke up. But since this is the first time I'm seeing you since last week, some of you and some of you over a long period of time, so it's always a great pleasure and honor to see souls returning to this earth. And it's a gift and a blessing that some of us take for granted, that every morning when we do awake, it's not just an accident and it's not a random thing we should just dismiss, but it's actually a gift. It's a blessing. It's God renewing His contract with us and saying, here's your soul for another day, and let's see what you're going to do with it. So that's a little meditation each of us can think about. And at the end of the day, there's another prayer we say, Biyotcha afkid ruchi, I entrust my spirit in your arms. Which is an interesting expression, in your arms, like an embrace, a nurturing embrace. So at the end of the day, we say, here's what I was able to do with my soul today, and now I entrust it to you. And I sure hope that you renew your contract again with me tomorrow morning. And so it goes, day by day. So in Jewish tradition, we never take for granted anything. There's no such thing as just a monotony of and continuum of activity, and it's just the same old thing. You know, the more things change, as the cynics say, the more they stay the same. There's nothing new under the sun. But no, every day is a renewal of energy and a renewed contract, and your spirit and soul are given to you fresh. And then, of course, the challenge is whether you're going to allow that new, fresh soul to be overwhelmed and overburdened by the day's activities, by your job, by other oppressive forces. And that's up to us. If we go in with an attitude where you are in control and your soul is a fresh force renewed that day, then there's nothing that really should be able to overwhelm you. But the fact, however, is that our memories are intact. So even we wake up afresh, in a sense, but we remember yesterday, and we remember our obligations and our pressures, and all the other stuff that is part of our lives, and has invaded our psyches, so to speak. And that's where the battle takes place. So, at least for this evening, since, as I said, I see you, even those of you that I saw last week, so in a sense it's a moda ani, and it's an honor and pleasure, and to sit here with you and perhaps try to empower our souls even further to really take on any challenge. Because the stronger your soul is and the stronger your commitment to your calling and your mission, the more likely it is that other forces will not be able to hinder or in any way hamper and compromise what you're driving at. I know it may sound easier said than done. It is easier said than done. But at least it has to be stated, because if that's our objective, we can at least aspire to it, even though we may not fully achieve it. But like, you want to know, they sell automobiles, cars, they tell you, it can go 180 miles an hour, 200 miles an hour. Now, most of us don't drive that speed. But you want to know what the capacity of your car is, even if you never go that far. So it's good to know that your soul has a lot of power, more than any of us may ever imagine. And that's what really allows us to have the confidence and security to really take on any particular challenge. And you'll find the people that are most courageous and fearless are the ones that have very strong connection to what they think their soul is and their calling is. But that, you don't just build courage in the vacuum. When you know what you want and you have a very strong commitment to it and dedication to it, then everything else pales in comparison, and cannot measure up to that driving force. However, when you're floundering and not really sure what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing, and therefore your commitment to your own soul's calling, higher calling, is weak, it's obvious then that you'll be continuously distracted and overwhelmed by the daily pressures and oppressive forces that I mentioned earlier. So that's a small introduction. So I welcome also your souls here this evening, and hopefully I can let my soul communicate as well, soul to soul. However, as you've seen, the topic tonight actually was not about the soul, it was about the body, which is listening to your body. And it's directly connected to a theme and a story in this week's Torah portion, which I will hopefully try to convey in a way and you'll see that it's fascinating, as it fascinated me when I first recognized it. That even though the story in the Bible seems so archaic and primitive and even weird and bizarre, and yet when you really understand its psychological and its spiritual message, it's profoundly visionary psychology, as we shall soon see. So I can begin from the psychological side, I can begin from the Torah side. Which way do we go here? I usually begin from the psychological, but let's start with the story. It's as I said, a pretty bizarre story. So you have the story here. Vayar Balak ben Sipar. Just to put things in context, this is a biblical story. Most of the Bible is occupied with the Jews' journey through the wilderness. They left Egypt, spent 40 years wandering through the wilderness. Now they're getting closer to the promised land. And as they get closer, the countries that live on the other side of the River Jordan and around Israel and the Holy Land feel threatened by the Jews because they're marching here and they've heard about all these stories about what happened in Egypt and the different episodes and wars and so on. So Balak, who was the king of Moab, the Moabites, which was basically a nation that lived on the eastern bank of the Jordan, like where Jordan is now, Jordan the country, a little south of that. You could see it on some of the biblical ancient maps and some of the Bibles, they have pictures of it. So as the Jews began traveling toward the Holy Land, because remember, God did not take them, if you know the map, took them through the Sinai wilderness, but if you go to the Sinai wilderness, you go straight, you go through Gaza into Israel. But God took them around certain countries, because that was part of the agreement, not to walk through certain countries that God had promised that the Jews would circumvent. So they went, instead of going into Israel that way, they went from the bottom tip, where Eilat is, the bottom southern tip. They went from the bottom up and came around through the Jordan side, which is the eastern bank of Israel, of the River Jordan. Basically, through Saudi Arabia, you can say, through Saudi Arabia, what today is Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and now they're arriving, and they come through this country called Moab, whose king is Balak. And as the Torah continues, that Moab became Balak, the king became, and his nation became very terrified and overwhelmed by the Jewish people, because there weren't a few of them. We're talking about a large nation here. I'm reading straight from the Bible here, from the Torah, and translating, because there were so many. So Moab, which is another name for Balak, sometimes the king is named after a country, he says to the leaders of the country, of Midian, which was a neighboring country, he says, this nation is going to come around us, and they will completely consume our resources. So they decided we have to find a way to stop this march of the Jewish people that was coming into this country of Moab. So they send messengers to find a great prophet that lived at the time. His name was Balaam. So we introduce character number 2, Balaam. And he was a prophet, a non-Jewish prophet, which is interesting in general, just as an aside, that usually in any type of religious disciplines or holy texts, you don't usually give credit to anyone else except your own people. The Torah, there's no problem saying that there was a Gentile prophet. It's not only Jews that were prophets. And as a matter of fact, to go to the extent, I'll tell you this: it says that the Torah says elsewhere that there was no prophet as great as Moses among Israel. So the commentaries ask, why does it say among Israel? Why doesn't it just say there was never a greater prophet as Moses? And the Medrash answers, because among Israel there was never such a great prophet, but outside of Israel there was Balaam. So he was equated to Moses himself. That's a kind of great prophet the Torah itself gives credit to. So they go to this Balaam because they know Balaam was not a lover of Jews. He would fit perfectly into many European countries today and other parts of the world. But he was also a prophet, so he had power. And basically the messengers come with a message that we have this nation that's coming out of Egypt, and they're away and we're terrified of them, and we need you to come and place a curse. Curse this nation, because they're very powerful, that they should not be able to hurt us. They should basically be stopped in their tracks. Anyway, the Torah continues that these gentlemen, these messengers went to Balaam. They delivered the message of Balak. Obviously, he was ready to pay whatever it would take. And then the Torah says that Balaam says that, here, rest overnight, sleep over here overnight, and I'll tell you in the morning what my answer is. Because being a prophet and a true prophet, obviously he knew he can't just go without permission from God. And it says that God came to Balaam that night and says, who are these people with you? And Balaam, of course, tells him that the Balak, the king of Moab, sent them to me, and they're looking to curse these people. God says to Balaam, do not go with them. Do not curse these people because they are blessed. Okay. Then he continues. So in the morning, Balaam basically tells the messengers, I'm sorry, I cannot go with you. This is not going to happen. And too bad. Anyway, Balak did not give up. And he sent another and even more distinguished committee and delegation to Balaam to persuade him. Yeah, I'm just reading along to just give you the summary to the point where I want to stop and focus on. And Balak says, I can't help you because you can give me even a complete home, a palace filled with gold and silver. I cannot defy the word of God. In other words, you're coming to me because you consider to me a prophet of God and I have power to curse them. But I cannot do that. The money is not the issue here. The issue is that God doesn't want me to do it. Anyway, finally, one second, let me just read this. But Balaam, remember, in his deepest part of his heart, definitely wanted to go with them. So he was looking for some excuse. So finally they persuaded him, and he decides he's going to go. Okay. And here's the key part of the story that we're going to talk about this evening. So it says, Balaam woke up in the morning. He saddled up his asenai, say donkey, say jackass, whatever word you want to use. It's going to be relevant to our discussion soon, as you'll see. And he goes with these ministers of Moab. And of course, God is extremely angry at him. He had told him specifically, do not go. And here's where the story takes a whole strange twist. You'd think, if you think naturally, God told him not to go, so no way he can really fulfill his mission. And God could stop him many different ways. Could definitely not let his curses have an effect. So, what point does it? But instead, the story goes on like this. It says that God sends an angel to stand in the path, in the road that Balaam is traveling on sitting on his donkey. And Balaam went with two of his assistants. And the donkey saw the angel, but Balaam didn't see the angel. So the donkey became terrified because he saw an angel in his path. That's what it says here. And with a flaming sword in his arm, the angel had. And therefore the donkey started trying to swerve from side to side and not be able to travel further. But the angel blocked the entire way, so the donkey froze in space. That's what it says. To the point that Balaam got very upset because he didn't see what's going on. He saw his donkey's just behaving, insanely, rebelling against him, and he begins to hit the donkey. And the angel kept on approaching to make it more difficult to tighten the whole path. There was nowhere to turn. And as the angel got closer, the donkey got wilder. As the donkey got wilder, Balaam got angrier. And as he gets angrier, you'll see all these details are very relevant. That's why I'm elaborating. That the donkey collapsed under Balaam. And at that point, Balaam became absolutely furious and started really striking at the donkey in a rage. And so that's not bizarre enough. Here's the most bizarre part. This verse. Vayiftach Hashem es piyasam. God opened the mouth of the donkey. That's what it says. The donkey began to speak to Balaam. He says, "Why are you hitting me?" He says, the donkey says to Balaam. "You've already hit me now 3 times. Why are you striking me?" And Balaam answers, "Because you're not supposed to be rebelling against me. You've been a loyal donkey all your life, loyal servant, and here you're rebelling against me." And the donkey responds, "But I'm your donkey. You've ridden on me, and you trusted me from the day that I came into your possession. Have I ever let you down?" And Balaam says, "No." And then the Torah continues that God opened up the eyes of Balaam, and he suddenly saw the angel standing there with a flaming sword, and he realized what's going on. It says Balaam got off the donkey and bowed in respect of God's presence there. And the angel says to Balaam like this, "Why did you hit your donkey these 3 times? I was the one that was blocking him from going. It wasn't him. And I saw your donkey, and had you continued doing so, I would have killed you and let the donkey live." And Balaam finally acknowledges that I've sinned. I did not know you were standing there. And if you feel that it's the wrong thing for me to do, I'll return back to where I'll go back home. And at this point the angel says, "No, since you're on your way already, continue your journey. And you will repeat and say only that which God tells you to say." And then the story continues, elaboration, how Balaam goes. And here I won't go into all the details, I'll just tell you the end of the story. We'll return to this section here. Balaam finally goes, meets Balak, tells Balak to bring all kinds of offerings, and he prepares to curse the Jews. But as he tells Balaam, he tells Balak, "Remember, I can only say what God puts into my mouth. So no guarantee." And instead of curses, out of Balaam's mouth come a whole series of blessings. Of course, Balak is outraged. Balaam is also outraged, but he has no choice. So he says, "Bring another series of offerings." And they try again. And this time even greater blessings come out of his mouth. And then finally a 3rd time. And the blessings that Balaam shares and states in this chapter are literally the greatest blessings the Jews ever received from anybody. To the extent that we say it every day in the morning prayer. When we say in the morning, "Matovo alecha Yaakov," how good, how beautiful are the tents of Jacob, Mishkanesecha Yisrael, and the resting places of the Jews. These are all Balaam's blessings. As a matter of fact, Maimonides says that this chapter and the blessings of Balaam is the first place where the messianic promise is delivered in the Bible. Because the verses that he speaks later about what will happen in the future, what this non-Jewish prophet states, is referring to Mashiach coming, and that one day the world will come to a place of peace and unity, time of redemption. And all this is Balaam, the enemy, who was hired to curse the Jews. At the end of the story, obviously, it becomes apparent that it's not going to help. So at that point, it wasn't really wise to try another fourth series of curses, because they'd even get better blessings. It would have been good for us, actually. But they didn't. They stopped there. And, of course, everybody goes home extremely devastated. But they also understood that it's not going to work this way. And Balaam finally has the final say. He tells Balak at the end of the chapter, he says, this nation is blessed. You and I will never be able to curse them. If you want to get to them, you have to get them to hurt themselves. You have to get them to become divisive and fight among each other, because we cannot do anything to them. And that's when Balaam comes up with a brilliant plan. He says, send the beautiful Midianite women to visit the Jews. And that's where the chapter ends. That's where the downfall comes. So it wasn't a curse. It wasn't a supernatural thing. He needed the Jews to kill themselves, basically. And that's what they did. But there's a happy ending to that, too. That's for next week. But the plot thickens. But here's the most obvious question. Not even getting into whether you're a skeptic and you believe the miracle of a donkey speaking or not. The question is, why was it necessary? Even according to people of faith, it says that God doesn't do miracles for no reason. I mean, the whole thing with the donkey. If God didn't want Balaam to go, he could have basically stopped him many ways. He wanted to send an angel, fine, send an angel, and Balaam sees the angel. He's a prophet after all. God speaks to him all the time, so for him an angel is no big thing. See an angel, and he sees the angel is blocking him. No. God sends the angel that the donkey should see the angel. And in order to, and Balaam doesn't see this revelation. And it's only when the donkey resists that Balaam finally hits the donkey. See, what do you need this extra miracle for? What do you need the donkey altogether in this story? Okay, fine, he went on a donkey. It seems like completely superfluous, unnecessary. And the donkey sees the angel, and then finally God opens his eyes, and now he also sees the angel, and the angel. And then all these details, the 3 times that he hit him, this the flaming sword, the fact that the angel tells Balaam that if you had continued to hit your donkey, I would have killed you and not the donkey. What does that mean? It means, what is the role of this donkey altogether? So this whole section here, if you think of it, the story could have been completely, God wants Balaam not to go. You're insisting on going. Okay, I'll transform your curses into blessings, which is a very interesting twist as well. We shall discuss that too. But what do you need this whole middle part of the story? God could have said, block him or stop him from going, etc., etc. Well, when you go into the deeper, as I said, psychological and spiritual story, which really is what the bigger question is, why is this relevant to us? Why do we need to know this entire thing in the first place? Not just the donkey part, all of it. It's an event that happened thousands of years ago. It's interesting to historical note to know that as the Jews were going to the promised land, there was a nation that tried to stop them. Instead of being cursed, they were blessed. It's a one-time event that happened thousands of years ago. Why do we need to know today that this happened, and what lesson does it have for us in our time? So there are many lessons, but I'm going to try to get to the core of the issue here. And in truth, the story, stripping it from all the characters and from the geography of when it happened and where it happened, well, really, it's the story of our own lives. That's really what's going on here. And to do that, we have to really understand who is Balaam anyway? What is the meaning of him being a prophet? And why is there a prophet that is able to curse? What's the meaning of that? We have a prophet Moses. So the real story, as I said, is the story of our own lives. We all will travel through a wilderness in our life. So the Jewish people really is a metaphor, a story for each of us through our journeys. Life, material world has many challenges. In many ways, it's like a wilderness. and very, very difficult and oppressive, as I said earlier. And the question is, can we make it through? And there will be forces, and there will be all kinds of people and instances that will see us as a threat. So if you try to maintain your spiritual integrity, there are very strong oppressive material forces that will not make it easy for you. So the story of Balak and this resistance is really the story of our own resistances in our lives as we try to find some type of deeper path. So anyone that's on the spiritual path knows that it's not easy. Not easy, as I said in the beginning of the class tonight, to just wake up every morning and remember that your soul is your primary force in your life. Because we live in a very materialistic existence and universe. It's called a soul is inside your body. And inside the body, inside of a physical world, that conceals, Belville, maybe put on the air. I think it's getting too oppressively hot. I feel like I'm in a desert, like a wilderness. I'll speak loud. See, that's the benefits of people sitting on the web, where they may, as I always say, they may be inside of a bubble bath or a very cold air-conditioned room. They don't feel the temperature here. So this challenge is great, and it manifests in many different ways for each of us. I can't go through every possible way because each of us has a different story of our lives. But think of it this way. You're born into this world, grow up in a home which is filled with risks. Some of us grow up in more functional homes than others, or maybe a better way to say it is more dysfunctional than others. And we have our challenges. We live in a world that's very selfish and greedy, self-interest. And even young children are hurt from a young age. And as they're hurt, the soul is a vulnerable force inside of us, but it's subject and it's at the mercy of those around it. If your parents or others are not nurturing and not loving, it's going to hurt you. There's no way around that. Children are vulnerable, impressionable, and very, very defenseless. If you grow up in a healthy home, so the healthy home provides a type of nurturing and spiritual oasis. But then we grow older. Even if we had a great childhood, a healthy childhood, then you thrust out into the world. You go out into the world for school, then work. And we all know that you don't always meet the best people. Sometimes you meet people that can be very cruel. Even people who love us can end up hurting us. And then, of course, the area of relationships, you fall in love, and many of us get hurt. Love always comes with and fraught with all kinds of risks and disappointments. So whenever it is that you can point your finger that you've lost your innocence, so to speak, or where first times you've really been hurt by the world around you, each in our own way, some more subtle than others, that is the wilderness of your life. So it's quite challenging because you have a very pure, unjaded soul, but it cannot just release itself in a world that is very hostile. Hopefully, if you find a healthy soulmate, you build a home, and you are able to find a way of developing security in this material world. So you can create an environment, as I said, an oasis where your soul can find peace and harmony. But that's not so common and not so easy. And even when we find that, that doesn't mean there aren't challenges. So life is filled with challenges. In the context of spiritual language, it's a soul trapped, you can say, held hostage in a material physical world with all kinds of agendas and duplicities. And we don't live in a world of truth. So to compare it, in the Hasidic literature, Kabbalistic literature, they talk about the soul. What kind of environment is the soul in when it's not inside the body? Why do we need to know that? I mean, we're here on earth, why do we need to know that? Because it's a very interesting study in contrast. And you see how much it resonates. Just like a child in its mother's womb for 9 months is protected from all the elements. And even the mother is even protected from the mother, because the mother's tantrums or other idiosyncrasies doesn't really affect the child in the womb, in most cases. Definitely doesn't affect like it affects later when the child is exposed to it. Yes, a mother ingesting certain foods and drugs and stuff can affect the child very dramatically, but in many, many ways, a child is very protected in that womb-like state. And as a result, it's another type of environment. So it's an interesting contrast, because when you think of it, you can understand how challenging it is when you're not in that type of world. But there's a point even before the womb, which is where the soul is completely free and not trapped in this material world. And by studying that, you get a sense of what it really means to be completely comfortable, completely at peace with yourself, in harmony. So a total spiritual state is where there's absolute harmony and seamlessness, something that is very rare and very difficult to achieve in this world. At best, we compartmentalize our fragmented lives, and we try to create some semblance of cohesiveness in an otherwise very complicated life. And we maneuver. We're always maneuvering. And we need our defense mechanisms up and our protection and so on. I think I've said enough about describing the reality of our lives here. You could fill in the rest in your particular so-called script. And here's why the story of Balak and Balaam is so relevant to this. Because now, if that's the story that we're traveling through this wilderness, and Balak represents the so-called the forces that feel the soul as a threat and do everything possible to suppress it. It just give you a subtle example of it. Maybe it's not so subtle. When the scouts said, a land that consumes its inhabitants, Israel is a land that consumes, and we don't want to enter there because we're spiritual beings and we don't want to go into the material world. I remember once giving a lecture on this topic. I'll tell you where it was. It was in London, in Canary Wharf. And it was the morning after Lehman Brothers closed down, went bankrupt. And my talk was scheduled months ahead on that morning, and no one knew what was going to happen. It was in a time when it was still an economic high. And the topic was something like, what can you achieve security when the economy is not secure, something like that. And because so many people were laid off that morning, I had a very big attendance at my talk, bigger than usual. It was lunch. And I remember, I spoke about this idea, how materialism is a land that consumes its inhabitants, and who of us has not had to compromise some of our ideals because of the marketplace pressures and so on, and conformity. And a fellow came over to me, and he said, I just was laid off, and I have to tell you that your words resonated absolutely in my life, and there was a point where I am ashamed of myself, what I did to some of my own friends in the firm. It is because the climate that our superiors created was such competitiveness that it absolutely turned us into monsters. I mean, there were always certain diplomatic rules, but behind the scenes, we became not human. Because you do anything for the bottom line, and to succeed, they created such incentives that forced you to have to hurt other people. And he said there was a point where I was completely oblivious, or chose to be oblivious. It's till you get the axe, and then you suddenly step back and you realize. He said, I lost my soul. It is a land that consumes its inhabitants. It consumed me. It was just the way it struck me. I mean, it's not the first time or last time I've heard it, but the way he put it that morning was very interesting. I remember it. So we all have places where we have been consumed and been compromised. Nobody is immune to that. So what do? That's the big question. Is there no hope? Do you have to live an ascetic lifestyle and somewhat free yourself from material activities in order to find spiritual integrity? We know that's not the Jewish approach. There are disciplines, spiritual disciplines, especially in the East, that advocate that. Because there's no way that you can maintain spiritual integrity in a material world. That's the argument. And there's a very good case to be made for that. So, this chapter talks about what we do. But not just in the business level, as you'll see, more importantly on the psychological level. and a very personal level. And interestingly, with all the talk about healing, abuse, as you'll see, this is the story of the soul and the body. And it's an unbelievable, counterintuitive conclusion that you'd never believe that it's the body that can save the soul in a strange way more than the soul saves the body. So not only is the body not ends up being an enemy, it ends up being the savior. So let's continue the story in the psychological script of it. So the material world and everything it constitutes, whatever shape and form, your physical body or your needs, your temptations, all are at war with your soul and its interests. Because the soul is interested in only one thing, fulfilling its divine calling and making this world a better place, a more refined place. But there's another part in you that is very, very strong and dominates. It says, take care of yourself. Take care of your own needs. You hurt others? Too bad. Try to be nice as possible. That, what Freud called the id. Your need to serve, your selfish need to be and survive. So there's a battle going on. But being that the soul has its powers, because it definitely can bring people to very noble heights and great acts of virtue. So Balak, who represents the other voice, realizes he can't just go alone and challenge it, so he decides he needs to find some type of spiritual power to challenge the spiritual power of the soul. So Balaam and Moses, you can say, are the two alter egos. One is the prophet of holiness, and one is the prophet of doom. One is a prophet of light, and one is a prophet of darkness. And the way God structured the universe is Zelu umazeh asa lakim. Everything that has power in light is an equal power given to darkness to counter it. So we are faced with our true battle. There's a certain equal level playing field that each of us has to deal with. And Balaam is a formidable force. He's the force, basically, of, we'll call it selfish spirituality, where the soul, the Moses, argues that you should use your spirituality for higher purpose and beyond yourself. He says, fine, be spiritual, but it's about you and not about anybody else. You can be spiritually arrogant as well. So Balaam represents a very high level of spirituality, but is driven by self-interest. And it's not a contradiction. You may say, well, how could you be spiritually arrogant? You see it all the time. People are very spiritual people, even refined people, but it's all about them. You don't necessarily see them giving to others. As a matter of fact, they look down at those that are not so spiritual. You can be very spiritual and elitist as well. So the soul is not a guarantee that everything is just pure. It doesn't mean it has to be that way, but it could be that way. So you have this now, Balaam, the voice inside of us that is says, fine, satisfy your transcendental needs, whether it's through music, art, or love, or spirituality, or religion, but it's about you. It doesn't mean it's necessarily the purest form of it. So the soul can also be hijacked in our lives and be directed to things that are not necessarily so holy. Take, for example, any passion in life. Passion, dead people don't have passion. You have to have a soul to have passion. But that doesn't mean passion is always pure passion. You know, sexuality is maybe the most powerful force in a person's life, like a fire. It can bring a person to the greatest heights, but it could also bring them down to the lowest depths. You see it all the time. So spirituality is a very powerful force, but it doesn't always mean, if it's in the domain of Moses, it's going to be directed toward a holy, selfless place. And if it's the domain of Balaam, it's going to be directed to a very selfish, greedy place. And this is also a battle between the two. And now Balak sees this battle may be won, because now he's not dealing with materialism fighting spirituality. He's dealing with two spiritual voices. One saying, be passionate and selfish, and one saying, be passionate and selfless. But because it's spiritual, it's not so simple. It's not like Balaam can just do whatever he likes. And here's where the story gets interesting. And I'm going to go now to a completely different direction, but you'll see in a minute the connection. In Hebrew, the word for a donkey, here the word is osen, but sometimes the word used is chamer. Chamer, the Baal Shem Tov and others interpret, it's also chomer. It means the raw matter. The definition when you say matter and spirit, or matter and energy, would be chomer and surah. That would be like form and function, or body and soul. So, the word chamor represents anything that is part of the coarse reality of this world. And as I said earlier, everyone, especially spiritual people, would say, the body, at best you have to tolerate it. But it's definitely antithetical to spiritual growth. A body wants to sleep, wants to eat, wants to take care of its own needs. A body is a selfish force, interested in self-preservation, self-interest. It's the soul that introduces a more transcendent and a more altruistic attitude to life. So now I want to talk about this, but from the other angle, and you'll see how it reconnects in a moment. In psychology today, relatively new, they talk about listening to your body. Not just to your soul, listen to your body. That a body, being that it's a partner in your journey, your life journey, so experiences that you have endured throughout your life, your body has memories of. For example, I gave a few examples in the description of the class. Even simple things like why certain things give you goosebumps or make you blush. Certain times, the more deeper, you have, let's say, butterflies in your stomach. Or you get tied up in knots. These are all physical reactions. They're not spiritual reactions. They're physical. Your body itself is reacting to something. And sometimes it could be very deep. It can be very profound bodily reactions to things. You can break out in a rash, itches, tics, different contortions. You hear, for instance, people who've been hurt in their lives, and you put them in a certain situation, and suddenly they can literally curl up, almost like in a fetal position, to protect themselves. This has been documented. People who've been hurt, especially in child abuse, you find them curling up in fetal positions during sleep. They're trying to protect themselves from being hurt. It's also a type of position that is very self-nurturing, like a baby in a fetal position. So we have many body language is a very profound language. It's much more than what you hear. You know, I meet somebody, your body language. Deeper than that. There's body language that's beyond our control, absolutely beyond our control. You'll be in a situation and suddenly you'll have a reaction. You don't know why. Somebody can say a certain word. And again, you may not even remember where you heard that word before, but you'll have a reaction. Sometimes very severe reaction. Now, of course, people who've gone through particular trauma will have very strong bodily reactions. So on one hand, they can be very terrifying, but on the other hand, they actually can be a blessing because they warn you, they tell you something's happening. No different, for instance, when a doctor, let's say, is looking for the cause of a pain you may have and touches and feels, and then suddenly gets close to a raw nerve, and you suddenly cry out because he's getting close to it. Same thing in communication. When you speak to people and you're trained in how to speak to a soul, you can tell when you're starting to touch upon an area and the person begins to react. They can react like they suddenly get very cold and detached. They sometimes laugh. Sometimes reactions are very different than what you'd expect because you're touching it that they don't want to talk about. And someone's particularly tough, or thinks they're tough, they have very interesting reactions that they've developed very sophisticated bodily ways to protect themselves from going to a certain place. And this is something that's just beginning to be studied in psychology. As you'll see, this is directly the story of Balaam and the donkey in a most powerful and relevant fashion. So, but I want to first elaborate a little more on this body language that we have. And I want to qualify this. Doesn't just mean severe trauma is where it expresses itself. We all have body language. just in severe situations, it's very amplified. So it's easier to identify in a way because it's very apparent. There's this phenomenon, they call it an out-of-body experience. And I tend to think of it in a way like a type of psychological hypothermia. You know what hypothermia is? Hypothermia is a true phenomenon, especially children, for some reason. I guess because their bodies are more balanced. A child falls under ice, for instance, and the body is, for an extended period of time, in sub-freezing temperature, water, which of course is extremely dangerous. The body will go into what's called a hypothermic state, where years ago it was actually mistaken to be death, true death, because the person doesn't breathe, the lungs stop functioning, the heart stops beating, even the brain can't be measured completely. So it looks like death in every way, and there have been children proclaimed dead due to this situation because they were under the water or they got too froze. They froze to death. But they discovered it's not the case. There has been, I don't know of the first instance, but you probably can find it, where a child proclaimed dead, but then a doctor came in, they were ready to take the child away, and witnessed a certain twitch or something, and realized the child was not dead. Why did they think the child was dead? It wasn't a mistake. All the major organs and all the vital signs were not there. And they discovered what they call hypothermia today, that the body, in order to protect itself, will go into a state of almost death, complete unconsciousness, to preserve the vital, only the minimal amount of energy in order to keep the child alive. So it'll shut everything else down just to keep that, which really, by the way, is all illness. What do you think illness is? The problem with illness is if it goes too far, it can lead to death. But illness is really the body is focusing all its energy. That's what an infection is, to try to fight the infection. Or, for example, going into a state of shock or a coma. Even though it's a curse per se, but why it goes into a coma? Because there's been an accident or some shock to the system, so the body's trying to preserve energy only with the vital areas. So a person can be, God forbid, like a vegetable, because all the energy is going only to keep the heart beating or the brain working. So again, it's not a blessing per se, but it's a blessing because a person could have just died. So severe trauma creates a whole type of, triggers a whole system, immune system within us, to do whatever it takes to preserve life. Psychologically speaking, when children, and again I'm speaking in extreme abuse situation. I only speak extreme because it's easier to identify and then more subtle, but then I'll bring it back to a more so-called average situation. Is that someone who's been abused, especially sexual abuse, so there's documentation that a person who endures very, very difficult abuse, severe abuse, especially from a close person, a loved one, supposed to be a loved one, the shock to the system psychologically is so profound that the child cannot tolerate to believe that it's happening. So you have real evidence of out-of-body experience. What does that mean? It's like being in a situation where you just can't accept that it's happening to you. So it's almost like you lock away a part of yourself where nothing is happening to that part, and you almost assume another identity. This may sound crazy to some of you, but this is not at all crazy. It actually is very real, unfortunately, for some people. It's like when a person is in a very traumatic situation, they'll sometimes fixate themselves on a certain image, and that image forever will remain with them. They will not remember the experience, but they remember the image. How is it possible that children, for example, don't remember unbelievable traumatic experiences? You'd think the most traumatic is the thing you remember most, because it's too horrible to remember. So it's like an out-of-body. It's like it didn't happen to me, and you lock it out. You may remember glimpses, but you don't remember all of it. We all have examples of it, because we've all had our own share of experiences. You know, I don't know if any of you came here for such a raw conversation this evening, but hey, you know, Meaningful Life Center offers it all. Trying to lighten the mood here, but Now you'd think, what's going on here exactly? What is the meaning of all this? Well, I'll tell you what the meaning is. In the 70s and 80s, the popular term that began to be coined was the inner child. To discover the inner child. I got to a point where it became a cliche and it's overused, and I see it on bumper stickers already, But there was a time, and still today, where it's actually a very profound and very useful tool to help people reconnect to that inner child. Now, where did the inner child go? The inner child disappears or goes undercover. Like what happens when a child is scared? It runs under the table. We all do that all the time, even as adults. You may not run under a table, but you hide. You hide your personality. You don't want yourself to be hurt. You get in a situation where you feel threatened, or you don't feel trust, or someone's getting too close to you, actually. What do people do? They shut down. They run. They hide. Why are you hiding? Because there's a child in you that has not developed the security and confidence that you can stand on your own, even in a vulnerable situation. Vulnerability scares you. Scares us. It's usually the sign of a child that is still, in some ways, still a child. Nothing wrong with it. We all have it inside of us. Remember, we were all once children. And in many ways, we still are in some parts of ourselves. So there's nothing to be ashamed. But we don't like to talk about it because it makes you feel like, oh, what am I, a little kid? But we all know there are times that you can cry. Someone says something to you and you say, what am I? I'm 25, 30, 40 years old. Why am I crying about like a 2-year-old? And you're embarrassed of it. So it's not something. And then people, you share with somebody, they'll start laughing at you. What are you being a baby? So stuff like that. And even as children, we're laughed at sometimes, where a parent will silence a child and say, only babies cry. These are all very unhealthy forces that force a part of you to go undercover. There's no person I've never met a person that doesn't have a certain part of them that's undercover. The question is how much of you is undercover. If 90% of you is undercover, you need a lot of help. I mean in a good way. A lot of work is necessary. But 20%, 30%, 10%, I'm not talking about exact numbers, is something very common. And hopefully if you find someone that you really will love in your life, you'll open up to them and you'll be able to be comfortable with being vulnerable with them. But that requires trust. But what's happening when that trust is there? A part of you is emerging. I mean, that's what really is expected when you love somebody, that they can help nurture and cultivate a part of you that the outside world you're just not going to expose because you're afraid of getting hurt. Now, we all deal with insecurities and fears and stuff like that. So, in the context of the body language or the body carrying messages, and what is the listening to the body, the interesting thing that God does, that when they go back to that child, when a child is hurt, like the hypothermia, it's really a way of saving the child. Because for a child to imagine that its parent or someone that loves the child can hurt it to that extent is worse than death. You see, it's been proven that children, you see, think to yourself, how would a child who's living in an unhealthy home, why don't they just leave home? See, because a child in its own narrow perspective doesn't see there's a world outside of the home. Children have been asked this question, young children I'm talking about, their connection to their parents is so deep that they think that if they walk out the front door, they'll literally fall off the earth. Children have been asked this question. They think that outside of the door, you're off the earth. Now, they know they've walked outside the house. They've seen a store. They've seen places they've traveled to. But psychologically, that's how they feel, that everything outside of this little room that they're in is death. So you can imagine if something is unhealthy going on in that home, the child cannot tolerate it. And that's why you have the phenomenon of children blaming themselves. Children of divorce. Why would children blame themselves? Two parents can't get along. Why would a child blame himself? It doesn't even make sense. Because children cannot tolerate the people that love them and that they love are not perfect. So then what else could have gone wrong? If they're perfect, then it must be me. Now, I know that's not rational, but that's how children think. So in a strange way, what God did was, He says, you know what, because you live in a tough world, I will let your body, so to speak, recede in the background, and it will remember what happened, but it will be in your unconscious. And the day will come when your child can be released in a very safe environment. Like with the hypothermia that I mentioned. What happens really is all the energy is focused on to survive till the point comes where the body can return to its natural state, and then the energy returns. The same is here. In a way, when you live in a war zone, in a very abusive or unhealthy environment, God allows the body, so to speak, to split into two and allow one part of you to almost like disappear, go into hiding, till the day when you come to a more safer place, you can emerge. In many ways, this is the essence of real serious therapy, to help the person re-emerge and in safety, to help them reintegrate and not be split into two. Because you'll find many people will say, you know, I have two lives. I am how I am at work when I'm projecting and people think I'm cool and tough and blah, blah, blah. And on my own, I'm really a little scared little child. Many people will describe this dichotomy. This dichotomy is very common, much more than you think. And it's all a result of the splits that happen in our lives and the way we learn to adjust. So in a strange way, it's not the soul, it's the body that carries a whole series of memories. And even though it may make us uncomfortable, when you go into knots or something your body is telling you that you are uncomfortable with, it's really a healthy sign. It means your body's reminding you there's something for you to address. Remember, pain ultimately is a blessing, not a curse. Pain is a symptom that there's a problem. A person who doesn't have nerves, God forbid, doesn't feel pain. So though pain as an end in itself is not comfortable, and we take painkillers, but without pain, and I mean on all levels, we would have no warning that there's a problem. It's quite healthy for a human being to come into an environment that's dangerous, and before they enter, feel and sense there's something wrong. So you get out of there before you get into trouble. I'm not suggesting that it's healthy to have a world that is dangerous. But once you do have a world that's dangerous, it's healthy to have the sensitivity to that. So we're blessed with certain sensitive tools, instincts, you can say, intuition. It's sometimes even bodily reactions that tells you something is wrong. The goal of it is to do something about it. So no healthy practitioner or soul healer or therapist should try to assault a person's psyche to the point where you try to get their whole bodily reaction to go into complete freeze mode. But a healthy nurturer will help a person slowly learn to trust. Just had a situation recently, more than one, but this just happened just a few months ago. So a couple got married, happened to be both observant, and after the first time they were intimate together, excuse me, they had real trouble, because when he came closer to her, she froze up, and something that he never saw before. I don't ask them if they were intimate before or not, but let's put it this way: they were getting now married, so I guess it was now living together. They were no longer just a boyfriend and girlfriend. And of course, it became apparent that she had gone through some abuse. So when you have some sexual abuse, it's not so simple to be intimate in a healthy way. Some people manage it. That doesn't mean it's healthy. It just means they've learned to so-called split themselves into two well, as I said earlier. But in this case, but I remember very clearly, and he was like shocked. He never saw anything like this. So I had to explain to him privately that you have to understand that she's not reacting to you. It's not about you. And as a matter of fact, it's because she's vulnerable with you and she's opening herself up. That's why she's reacting. Because she was in an environment, because he saw her always as a tough woman and someone that can handle anything. I said, when she's in a place where she's not threatened or she's not vulnerable, she's not going to react that way. Anyway, thank God they worked it out, because he's an intelligent guy, but it took a lot because he had to depersonalize it. And he said to me, what am I supposed to do? I said, well, you're going to have to learn to hold her and nurture her even though she may be trembling. If you really love her. He says, is that what I have to do? It's like an uneven relationship then. I said, well, right now it's uneven. There are other things I'm sure that you don't have that she can give you. But it takes work. The point I'm trying to make is that her body was now beginning to bring back messages from her experiences. And this, again, very, very common. In situations where people, I'm giving one example. It can be completely different areas. As soon as you start getting into a trusting environment and feeling more vulnerable, the body is going to start trying to get your attention. And that happens to be a healthy thing. Because it would be very unhealthy if she did not tremble, because if she was able to disconnect, he wouldn't really have a relationship with her. He'd have a relationship without her. that inner her that she put into hiding would never be there, and someday it would pop up, and no way that it would remain disconnected. So it was actually a blessing that it emerged so early. Because I seen situations where it emerges later, and then it's much, much more difficult, because then you're dealing with, I don't even recognize you. The person I married is not the person that who you've become. So these are just examples, but let's go back to the Balaam and Balak story. Okay. So Balaam, as I mentioned, represents somewhat of the soul. You could say corrupt, but it's still the soul. And now he's about to go, and he's trying to so-called challenge the healthy soul. So God could have, of course, told Balaam, listen to me, you can't go. He did tell him, actually, you can't go, but he didn't listen. So clearly that's not going to work, because Balaam in his own devious mind has found some way to justify his going, because he was very interested in doing this job. So you have, the donkey comes into play. It's not the soul that wakes him up, it's his body. In this case, you have the chamar, and as you see, the words in the Torah talk about how loyal I've been to you. I've been with you all your life. Is the body can wake up the soul sometimes to something the soul itself is not aware of. That's exactly the story that's going on here. If you read the words, you'll see almost word for word. The thing that struck me as I was reading it this morning was it says that the angel tells Balaam that if you would have continued hitting your body, I would have killed you and not the body. I find that to be like amazing. It means I would kill the soul before I would kill the body. Because you see, the body from a Jewish perspective is not a bad thing. Yes, a body can be selfish and deal with its own needs. But as I said earlier, the body is created by God. And therefore, when the soul was put into the body, it wasn't just the soul that was divine, but it's also the body. And there will be experiences in your life that only your body will know and will remind you, and your soul may not be aware of. Maybe because the soul is not in the domain of psychological pain, whatever the reason is. So the body carries these messages, and then comes a point where there's a confrontation, and it is only the body that sees. So, for example, let's take a situation. You're living your life. Another scenario. You know, someone they call functional addicts. You know, this particular individual has got plenty of issues with drinking and with some foreign substances, some drugs. But he's convinced himself everything is pretty cool because he functions well. Goes to work, never misses appointments. You know, he's learned to function. It's called functional addict. But a little while ago, his life started, he got involved in some gambling problem and money problems. Somewhere it starts catching up with you. But he's living years and years, and he's a brilliant guy. He's found a whole system of how to function. He has every excuse in the book. He's brilliant at covering his tracks. He convinced himself he's happily married. His children have no clue. He's like a real, and he's making money, so everything seems fine. And then something gives. And the guy happens to be a very spiritual person too. It's a pleasure to talk to him and all that. I know him for quite a few years, and I'm quite familiar with his tactics. It's not my job to rock his boat. I have other issues to deal with. If he's not ready to rock it, I'm not going to rock it. But then things started falling apart. But he didn't admit that it's falling apart. And it began not in his soul level, it began on his body level. It began things like, that his body started reminding him. And I saw their exact example of this. The soul was not ready to hear. Because he has it all worked out. He's a spiritual guy. He loves Shabbos. He loves Judaism. And his body began to tell him things. The drugs started having an impact. He was telling him he can't sleep at night. So it's interesting, to him, he needed his body to wake up his soul. It's exactly the story of this chapter. It's not Balaam wakes up the donkey. How do you imagine? A donkey is waking up a prophet. And that's why this miracle happened. It wasn't, why would God, as I said earlier, it's the strangest miracle possible. There's so many ways to get the message to Balaam, but nobody couldn't hear it. So God says, "Vayiftach pi ha'osan," I'll open up the body's mouth and let the body start speaking to you. And Balaam was very shocked because it's his own donkey. It's his loyal servant. Imagine your body is starting to rebel against you. And you're saying to your body, listen to me. We're going to do this today. And your body says, listen, I can't do it anymore. You know, you've been drugging me up and drinking and all that. I can't do it. And you start hitting your body and you say, look, I'm in control here. That's exactly what Balaam was doing. He was telling his donkeys, cooperate. And the body was saying, I can't cooperate. Something's wrong. It sensed that there was a problem. And he keeps hitting it because it's making him uncomfortable. He's saying, why are you making me uncomfortable? Any person who has a problem in their life and then the body starts rebelling, what do you usually do? You try to, what they call it, you self-medicate. What do you think self-medication is? It's trying to get rid of the pain. You numb yourself. But then the body comes back with even more violent reactions. And you try to numb it even further. So it's your body that can end up saving you because it's basically saying enough is enough. And here's what happens. That body begins to speak. The soul refuses to listen. It hits and finds all kinds of ways to continue the damage until finally it opens its eyes and realizes, yes, there's an angel. There's something seriously wrong in my life. And the soul, in a sense, has gotten so corrupt because it's the soul and its spiritual powers and its wisdom. Think of it this way. I'm trying to remember, it's a story. I don't remember the full story, I just remember the moral of the story. So forgive me. But the moral is the key point, the key thing anyway. It's a whole story about a king who is very corrupt. He begins very benevolent, but as power corrupts him, he becomes a very vicious leader. And because he has power and control and money, he can buy anything he wants. He has his wife killed, gets another queen, the whole thing. One of these most corrupt type of leaders. At some point, it becomes very clear that he's destroying his whole kingdom for his own selfish indulgences. So he has a wise counselor who knew him when he was a child, remembered him when he was a very pure king. And actually, I am remembering the story. This is the story. It's not just the moral. I just don't remember the details where and why. I don't know if it's a metaphor or it actually happened. Doesn't matter. We'll just tell. Anyway, the king knew this man. But as the king became more corrupt, this so-called senior who knew him who remembered his father, realized he can't say anything to him. He's not going to listen. So he stays in the background and really has nothing to say. But as the king keeps alienating his own inner circle, he realizes he needs to have this wise counselor. Not for help, mind you, but to protect himself, for selfish reasons. Because everyone respected him. So as the king was, like I said, his whole leadership was deteriorating because of all the people he betrayed, and he became hated by everybody. He calls in this wise counselor, the person he knew since he's a child. And this leader, this advisor, always loved him, and always loved the fact that who he represented. He just couldn't stand that he became so corrupt. So he says to him, so he comes to him to see if he can help, but he realizes that the king is not interested in real help. He's just interested in him to protect his back and to vouch for him. So he tells him, I can't really do that. And the king gets furious and blah, blah. At some point, the king finally threatens him and essentially buys his loyalty. And this man, this wise person who betrays himself and begins to protect the king in distorted ways. First he finds excuses. He's a smart guy. Because he's so smart, he has brilliant ways to justify the king's behavior. And he becomes the big defender of the king. To the point that people see how sad it is that the king not only became corrupt himself, he corrupted this person who was considered to be like the last hope. Anyway, the end of the story, it's a long story, but the end of the story is the king finally has a wake-up call. I don't remember what exactly happened, some major tragedy. And he realizes what he did. But at this point, this wise advisor created such a climate, so brilliantly and devious type of leadership, that it's like, it was such a mess. So he comes back to the person that was once the pure one, and says to him, look, I think we have to change things. But he became so corrupt, his advisor, and he, not really so corrupt, because he was so smart, he could not tolerate to believe that he actually used his intelligence for corrupt purposes, see, he becomes worse than the king. And the king realizes that he has to put him to death. Because he, in his brilliance, created such a powerful justification for all the corruption that it's as if it's all great. And the king realized, it's one thing when I'm corrupt and I know I'm corrupt, but here the guy thinks he's not even corrupt. The moral of the story is, it says in the Torah, that bribery, bias, blinds the eyes of the wise, and it distorts the tongue, the language of tzaddikim, of the righteous. It's a verse in the Torah. The question is asked, if it can blind somebody or distort somebody, then they're not so wise and not so tzaddikim, they're not so righteous. Why does the Torah call it chachamim, tzaddikim? Because bias is much more dangerous in the hands of the wise than the hands of the fools. Because a wise person, when he's biased, so wise he knows how to cover his tracks and doesn't let you even think that he's biased and convinces everybody that he's objective. He's so good at that. That's called the ultimate manipulator. So bias, everybody can be biased. The most dangerous biased people are the ones with the most power. So Balaam was, as I said earlier, was as a great prophet almost as Moses. Moses among Israel, and Balaam was equal to him. But precisely because he was such a spiritual prophet is why he became so distorted that it was only his donkey that could save him. It was only his body. So the soul, the interesting twist here is, which you usually don't hear. You usually hear, the story goes like this. The soul comes into a body, it comes into a physical world, gets trapped here. The light gets completely covered up by darkness of materialism and physical and bodily things. And you hope that one day the pilot flame of the soul, I am asleep but my heart is awake, the pilot flame of the soul will one day reawaken. That's usually the story you hope for in life. And here the whole story gets reversed. The soul becomes so trapped by the material life that it convinces itself that it's all holy and doing things for good purposes. And it's the body and its messages and its memories and its voice that wakes the soul up that there's something wrong. So take anxiety. Anxiety, why is a person anxious? Is anybody anxious when I say that? Huh? Anxiety is a sign that your soul is hungry. Any form of we'll call it disalignment, where you feel empty, aimless, something's bothering you, depressed, I'm not talking about clinical or medical, is always a sign that there's something not aligned properly in your inner life. And it's actually a blessing, because it's reminding you and not letting you get hurt before it's too late. Sometimes that message is not going to come from your soul, it's going to come from your body. So people who get tight, who get, as I said, in knots, or other messages of the body, stiffness and so on, it's your body telling you that the soul needs to wake up. And this is exactly what the chamor, the asan, vayiftach pia asan, the mouth of the chamor, the mouth of the body, the mouth of the material world wakes you up. When things don't work, there's a Kabbalistic concept called shviras hakelim, where the containers shatter. When, in some point in your life, where something really breaks down on a physical level, it's again your body reminding your soul that something's not working here. Now sometimes it will be your soul that will remind, but sometimes it will be the body. So this chapter, everything gets reversed, because Balaam is now on his mission to curse and try to use spirituality for corrupt purposes. So it's the body that says, no, that I'm not going that far. There's a Yom Kippur we say al-chet. It's a type of penitence, what some call confession. I don't like to use that word. So you say al-chet for different sins. But there's one interesting one that says al-chet shechatana b'yetzer hara. For the sin that I sinned with my evil inclination. So the Shalah asks, what do you mean? Every sin is with the evil inclination. Why suddenly there's one sin of the evil inclination? And the answer is very interesting. He says there are sins that even your Yetzer Hara wouldn't want you to do. You have convinced it to do something it never would do on its own. And you see this. Actually, I would say something, recreational drug use has something to do with it. All of us have taboos, inhibitions, they call it. And there are certain situations that if you take something or you force yourself, you can suddenly do something you yourself would never do on your own. And later you look at yourself and you see like a stranger in the mirror. But then it may be too late, because once you tasted from that forbidden fruit, it's not easy to go back. So think of times, there are things we all can conceive ourselves of doing. But there's sometimes you can do something that you really, on your own, you just have too much shame, too much inhibition. But you can force yourself to do things you would never do. That is an example, again, of the soul, in a way, forcing the body to do something it would never do, and the body will resist and say, that's not something I want. So the story turns itself upside down in this chapter, where there are situations where the body, the chamor, the osan, speaks to the soul and wakes it up to see the truth. And what happens then? So then comes the next section of the story. What happens then is the other twist. That's when curses can turn into blessings. Because now that we're already turning everything upside down, so usually a prophet of God would say the blessings of God. Here, what happens is this wake-up call, against Bilam's will, the body, he didn't want to hear the body's messages. The soul doesn't want to hear these messages. You don't want to hear these messages, that's fine. But now, as you begin to speak, I'll force you to say things you never wanted to say. So instead of speaking curses, suddenly this corrupt Bilam ends up sending blessings. And that's what happens when the healing process begins. When the body wakes us up and the body's messages and memories begin to emerge, what happens is the soul also begins to emerge. And even against its own, let's say, corrupt tendencies, it will end up reuniting and bringing great blessings to your life. So in this, in the psychological sense of it, it means that you'll find sometimes your deepest answers in the strangest places. Sometimes you find answers in synagogues and at the Kotel or in Jerusalem. But sometimes you find answers in the middle of the street and when you're completely immersed in your material life. That's when you know your donkey's speaking to you. It's a different answer. But God will reach you one way or another. If He won't reach you Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah or in synagogue through a prophet, He's going to reach you through your donkey, through your beast. And even our beast, even our animal inside of us, can also speak to us. So it's an interesting twist. You can't really run, basically. You know, you have the story for Jonah, we read it on Yom Kippur. So Jonah was a prophet too. And he ran from God. And he decides to go on a cruise. And into the waters. In his imagination, they say he felt that God, what did he think? That God is not in the water? That's what it says. But I guess he felt that in the water it's harder to find him. You know, there's no cities, water. But he's found by whom? Not by him and his soul, and not by the angel, by his hosts. And the captain of the ship gets up and says, the storm strikes the ship. And the captain of the ship gets up and says, something's wrong. You know, God is angry at us. At that point, Jonah realizes, now he's the prophet. He should have been the one that got up and said it. The captain says it. Like in this case, and that's what he gets up and he says those sad words. He says, no, you did nothing. It's me. I defied God, and as long as you keep me on this boat, you will not be safe. Which, of course, obviously, it woke him up. But how did he wake up? Not through his own conscience, not suddenly waking up and reminding there's a God in the world. He needed a reminder from outsiders. You know, and then what they do is they don't want to throw him over. They actually say, we will be punished for throwing you overboard. He says, no, I'm telling you, throw me over. And he throws them overboard. And the whole story with the whale and all that. For the Jews especially, you find this, sadly, in our history, sometimes when Jews attempt to assimilate, willingly or unwillingly, is the non-Jews that remind them that they're Jews. Sometimes when you betray your own calling, it won't necessarily be your soul that's going to wake you up, because remember, your soul is now part of your betrayal, and probably finds ways to justify it even. But there'll be other people that will remind you, and sometimes people that are completely a different level. So it's another example that it doesn't always come from the holier place. It sometimes comes from the body. Not that the body is not holy, but the body also has a divine power. And it's an interesting twist to the script. I find this to be very real, for example, in Israel today. And I remember a few years ago, I saw this article. It was translated into English. And it was so jolting, I decided to write an article about it. And I began my article by quoting this quote. And I'll tell you what the quote was. And then asking, who do you think this quote comes from? So this is the quote. The quote was, the Jews don't deserve to live in Israel because they're not ready to fight for it. That was the quote. And I wrote a whole bunch of options. Rav Kook, the Satmar Rebbe, and the Turei Karta, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the religious Zionists. Obviously, I also wrote other options. Now, you know where this quote is from? It's from a Al-Qaeda newspaper in Arabic. You hear that? That they're writing that the Jews don't deserve Israel because they're not ready to fight for the land that God gave them. We are. That's what they write. And I checked up that. I thought it was first a joke, a parody. It's like ridiculous. Now, I'm not in any way advocating them, but it struck me in a very deep way. You see, the Zionist dream was to find a homeland. And I'm not here, this is not an attack on Zionism in any given way. A homeland. In the end of the 19th century, for Zionist Congress, a man named Theodor Herzl, who was a journalist in Vienna, and he saw what we called the Jewish problem. That the non-Jews would never accept the Jews. And there would always be inherent discrimination and racism and all that. Yes, it was getting better because of the Enlightenment, emancipation, etc. Now, he was a secular man, didn't know much about Judaism, but he understood, in a political sense of the word, that there was a fundamental problem. Now, listen to this. And I don't say this, I say this with pain in my heart. I've read Herzl very, very intently to really see the roots of his thinking. Because, as any modern Zionist will tell you, Herzl is the father of Zionism, or modern Zionism. The truth is not at all true. Zionism is Zion, is something that goes back thousands of years. We pray for it all the time. But fine. I'm talking about the modern state of Israel. And his picture is up there. And I didn't know him, so I'm not here to criticize him. But I read his papers, so he has his book, his diary, that series, what's it called? Right? Alt Neuland, right? The Old New Land in German. I read some German because of Yiddish, so I read some of it there too, but it's also in English. And his first suggestion for the Jewish problem is, this is not a joke, mass baptism. So what he suggests, it's published. No one ever deleted that. He says clearly, acknowledged, that the older Jews are never going to baptize themselves. But if they want to preserve and get rid of the Jewish problem, these Jews that are lodged into the throats of the anti-Semites in Europe, they should advocate that their children and all the new generation should be baptized, so let them grow up like the rest of the country. That was his first suggestion. I know anyone who hears that, they say, it's like, come on, what is that? But honestly, he was sincere. Remember, his attitude to Judaism was a very secular one. It's outgrown its use. There was a time in primitive times, in the biblical times, where this tribe called the Canaanites had their customs. But like every African tribe, at some point the time comes and they move on. That was his attitude. Which meant that he had no idea of the spirituality of Judaism. He had no, I guess he didn't relate to the divinity of it. And I don't even know if it was malicious. It could be just, what did he grow up? He probably had no education. Now obviously this suggestion was not exactly embraced. So then started the idea of the homeland. So if that won't work, so the next is find a homeland that is completely Jewish. His first suggestion for that was a country called Uganda. You know, a guy called, remember, what was his name? Didi Amin, what was his name? I forgot his name. Is that his name? Didi Amin, remember him? Yeah. He was a cute guy. Not exactly, but anyway, Uganda. The problem with Uganda, besides the fact that there's no water, and which Jew is going to go move to a place where there are no beaches, Herzl didn't consider that, was that which Jew in their right mind is going to, who the hell would he move to Uganda? You know, come on. Again, he didn't relate to and understand. He thought it's just a technical matter. We got to just find a place. And Uganda seemed good in Africa, somewhere middle of Africa. Nobody lays claim to it. So just let's move in there. Talk about occupied territory. What would they say about us today if we occupied Uganda? Yeah. Anyway, the bottom line is it finally became Israel because clearly it was the national homeland, blah, 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 blah. Now you can understand, and I'm not here to say that I feel that way, why there are very religious and very ultra anti-Zionists when they read the motivations and the roots of Herzl's thinking. Because they say it has nothing to do with Judaism. First baptism didn't work. Uganda didn't work, so we're here. The argument against that is really, who cares what his motivation was? The bottom line is, millions of Jews have found a haven in our holy land. I mean, again, I'm not getting into now the debate about Zionism and what level, modern Zionism, anti-Zionism, this Zionism, that Zionism. There are, by the way, around 12 variations of Zionism, just for the record. I wrote about it once. There's socialist Zionism, there's spiritual Zionism, there's Jabotinsky version of Zionism. You know, there's a whole different version. Socialist Zionism was the one that really dominated. That was Ben-Gurion and so on. The kibbutz idea, etc. But the point I want to make is that ultimately the dream was united by, Jews were united by the dream of a homeland. That we would come to a land that would become a haven. And it did become a haven. Before World War II and then, of course, after World War II. And look what kind of country it is today. And it's not just it's a secular country in one way, but there's also booming yeshivas. And it's probably never been a renaissance of Jewish life as it is today in Israel. So there's good and bad in everything. I'm not getting into, again, there's plenty of problems. But there are plenty of blessings. But one thing that remains a haunting element is this, going back to what I said about from Al-Qaeda. Why are the Jews there? So if Israel would have turned out to be a Mediterranean Riviera, you know, hey, beautiful country, land of milk and honey, beautiful beaches, beautiful women, which they've been trying to export to get people to feel good about Israel. And there were no enemies around it, no one challenging it, fine. So you could say you achieved your dream, a homeland. The fact is, Israel is surrounded by hundreds of millions of people who don't want them there. There's no way that you could just say, leave us alone, and we just want to go to our beaches and our nightclubs. Because you're dealing with people who have religious passions, who say this land God gave to us, the Muslim world, because the Jews don't want it, or the Jews failed. Because that's what the Muslims feel. That first God chose the Jews. They believe in Moses the prophet. Then he chose the Christians because the Jews didn't work, and now he chose the Muslims because the Christians didn't work. That's basic Muslim thinking. Moderates are more moderate about it. Radicals will say you have to go to war for it. And as long as Israel is a Jewish state in the middle of the Ottoman Empire or the Muslim powers, it is a blemish on God's will. This is common Muslim thinking. Not everyone says go to war and kill everybody, but many do say that. But this is Muslim thinking. So what's the counter argument from Jews? Leave us alone. In the Western world, we don't kill each other. Unfortunately, passionate fundamentalism and radicalism will always win over complacent rationalism. That's how it is. There's religious passions here. And I go back to the story with Jonah and the story, relevant to sometimes the body has to remind you. I see a certain divine providence in this. It's interesting. Every Friday in the mosques in Israel and outside of Israel, their leaders are yelling about religious beliefs in the most obnoxious and disgusting way about Jews. But it's all quoting religion. And the Jewish response is always, we live in a secular world, leave us alone. It's not a response. It's not adequate in a place like Israel. In the strangest ways, they're reminding us that this is a holy land, and we want it. And what's your answer to that? Do you have more passion for this holy land than we do, or don't you? Now, I'm not in any way suggesting they're right. I'm suggesting that it's like the body awakening the soul in a way. And the fact is that in Israel you have many religious parties, but their response is not a visionary one that God blessed us with the promised land and we as Jews are going to bring civilization to the world. They say we want to live and give us our yeshivas and don't kill us. And the secular Zionists basically argue, like many secular people, that we don't want to talk about religion. That's not appropriate. Yeah, but go convince 1.2 billion Muslims that you don't want to talk about religion. Because even the most secular ones of them, look at Turkey, a secular country already. Also, religion is a force in the Middle East. Forget it. It's not going away just because some people think they're going to bring McDonald's and Apple and Microsoft to the Middle East and suddenly they're going to lose their faith. That's what arrogant Western thinkers think. Just give them a little taste of Western freedoms and you'll see they'll all lose their passions. That was what the Enlightenment thought in the 18th century too. That religion won't exist by the time the 20th century comes because we're enlightened. Well, for good or for bad, it does exist. Much of it, frankly, is distorted religion and fundamentalist and repulsive. But it's still there. So you have to think, why are they there? To me, it's a wake-up call, but maybe we need some healthy religious people that have a true spiritual vision. I'm just using the story of this chapter to explain how sometimes it's your enemy that wakes you up. Sometimes it's the place that you don't think it's going to come from. It's not coming from the Kotel Maravi, so it's coming from Al-Qaeda and others who are clearly stating that they are driven by religious passion. So obviously I don't agree with them in any sense, but I do feel very uncomfortable that they have more passion about the faith than many Jews have. So like Jonah had to be reminded by the people on the ship, sometimes you have to be reminded by the Vayiftach Pi Ha'asan. Sometimes the mouth comes from a place you never expect. So another twist on how God works, strange ways, and bring it back on a personal note. Those of you that think I'm a little off the wall because I've been talking about all these body language and how the body carries messages and memories, it's all right because a lot of people that I know think I'm off the wall, so I'm not feeling bad about that. But it's actually a compliment sometimes, not off the wall, but it's like on the wall, yeah? You disagree? You protest? Good. What about you? Are you off the wall? Huh? Okay. Good. So the point I'm making here is I think that there are profound psychological lessons in this chapter. And honestly, I don't see any other. I only can see the meaning, the significance in this story and relevance of why God would open up a donkey to speak when you think of it in terms, as I said, of our own bodies and sometimes our own physical life. But one more example of this before we conclude. We have now this recession. Now, as I said earlier, every painful situation, every loss is never healthy. But everything that cracks always is a wake-up call too. Remember, when an egg cracks, it's the sign a chick is about to come out. So when things crack, it always means there's a birth about to take place. And it's important to see the bigger picture. If people get so consumed with money and greed and corruption, it's going to crack. There's no way around it. So it's just a matter of time. And no one wants to feel the crack and no one wants to be there. But don't think it's not a wake-up call similar to the Piyasin. It'd be nice if the wake-up call came from heaven and from the soul, but sometimes, unfortunately, it doesn't usually work. It usually works when it comes from the bottom, because then you can't deny it. So capitalism is going through its own reality check. So yes, the old the gasps of an old system that is probably not going to go away so fast. It's like all things don't die easily. Old models. But it's the opening of a new paradigm. I have no question about it. I wrote about it last week, titled $600 billion, which we're working on. You know, like a guy tells me, I'm working on my second million. The first million didn't go so well. So he's working on a second million. So I could say billion. So everything has a certain wake-up call, and if it doesn't work, like I said, from outside, from heaven, it'll wake you up from earth. So think of, maybe you should put up a big sign, Vayiftach pia osen, and God opened the mouth of the donkey. The Zohar says that sometimes you hear someone lecture, and they're so impressed with themselves. The Zohar says this, and the Zohar says they should just read this verse, that if you think you're a great lecturer, remember that God can make even a donkey speak. So be careful before you call yourself an orator. Here we have a great orator who leaves us a very powerful message. So, what can I say? May our body and soul be completely in sync and wake each other up and find a certain harmony and peace that we can carry over into our lives, both here, both where we are right now, tomorrow, and the next day. And to end where I began, we say in the morning, thank you, God, for returning my soul to me. You could also thank God for returning your body to you, which is quite necessary for this journey to take place. You don't just want your soul, so I guess it's also a thank you for the soul within your body. And the soul has its own messages, and you have to know how to listen. The body has its own messages. You have to know how to listen. So the soul can wake up the body at times, the body can wake up the soul. Together they can achieve great things. It says in the Talmud, that when Mashiach comes, at the end of days, so who's going to get rewarded and who's going to get punished? So the soul says, punish the body, because I didn't do any sins. I'm a spiritual entity. I couldn't do a sin. And the body says, all I am is a dead corpse without a soul. How could I do a sin? So the example that the Talmud says is of a guy who owned a farm. And one day, he finds that the two workers that were there seem to have stolen a lot of his fruit. But one of them was lame, and one of them was blind. One couldn't walk, and one couldn't see. So they said, the lame one says, I couldn't walk, how could I steal your thing? The blind one said, I couldn't see, how could I steal it? So what he did was, he put the lame person on top of the shoulders of the blind person and said, I'll judge you both together, because that's what happened. You understand? So God says with the body and soul, I'll put the soul inside the body and I'll judge you together, because obviously the soul can't do anything without a body, and a body can't do anything without a soul. They're partners in crime and also in great things. So let that harmony dwell. And with that being said, I want to announce, proud to announce, excited to announce, a bunch of new programs that are happening in the next few weeks. Can you give me one of those? Oh, here. So if you don't have these flyers, please look at them. These are customized for you and your needs. So tomorrow night, it's not on this paper, tomorrow night there's a film screening here called The Human Experience, which I saw and highly recommend. It's very, will give you hope in the human journey. And, okay, let's go in order here. Tomorrow night Philip will not be giving, right? It's the film. Okay. July 1st, 8th, and 15th, we have, my own son is giving a new course called The Who's Who of the Talmudic Era. He's going to take 6 controversial figures in the Talmud and talk about them and also their relevance to us. This will also be online, by the way, not just in location, online. So you could see it anywhere. On July 6th and 13th will be a 2-part course on the Kabbalah of cooking. This will be actually hands-on with cooking and Shabbos, but also the Kabbalah story behind it. On the 22nd, the bottom right, is going to be a social night, which is, we don't call it singles in this place, but for many reasons. It's not going to be a meat market, but it's going to be a very creative, interesting experience. I don't know if you know Shimonish, it's quite good. We'll be here as a whole. I've heard from people who've done this that it has a way of revealing new dimensions in who you are and your relationships. And some good stuff has come out of it, meaning real shidduchim, let's put it this way. Real matches. This is not online, thank God. Yeah, we have J-Date already. This is on location. Real human beings. You know, you want to have relationships that are not just virtual. And then finally, yours truly, that's me. 100 minutes. Good. Will be giving a new 4-part. This is a webinar. We'll be here on location, but also online. It's called 8 Secrets. Discover the Soul in Everything. It's going to be taking 8 principles from the Baal Shem Tov, whose 250th yahrzeit is this year. And we'll be doing that. So I encourage you to sign up. Some of these do have a limit. They're going to do only 30 people, not more. So first come, first serve. They're all going to be quality programs. My guarantee. And if you want more information, you can speak to Velvel. Call my office. It's online. All the details are available. And you see, it's pretty nice images, which I would attribute to Batsheva, who designed stuff. She's good. I like the look and feel of it, if you ask me. And then I would like to say that this class has been dedicated, starting with Mark Belinsky in honor of his grandmother's yahrzeit, Sarah Bat Moshe, on the 10th of Tammuz, which was yesterday, and in honor of Levi ben Batsheva for refuah shleima and speedy recovery, and also in honor of Yaakov ben Nathan, father-in-law of Ben Goldstein, whose yahrzeit is the 7th of Tammuz. And if anybody wants to dedicate a class or any of these programs or events, a yahrzeit or any other special day, you can speak to me, Velvel Wave. There you go. And what shall I say? Our souls and bodies are traveling. Please see me as a kindred spirit and kindred body traveling with you, and we intersect and hopefully create some magic. So everyone have a very good... Okay, right. If you haven't left your emails, please leave your emails. Final announcement. And again, tomorrow night there will be this film screening. You're all welcome to come. All the information to register details, please speak to Belville or my office. Everyone have a great night. Thank you so much.